come on up, Jeff, and let's have a conversation. Yeah, let me get that side.
All right.
You get over here. So, how cool is this? Jeff, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we go back a little bit, and I have some context for your story, but why don't we just start by you sharing a little of your journey in a little bit more depth than I started with. How did you get to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. All my life I've felt basically two distinct callings, right? I've felt a calling from God to draw near to Him, and I think the story of my life is drawing near, falling away, being called back, lost and found. And the other distinct calling has been to consume, critique, and create copious amounts of pop culture. That's just been with me since the beginning. My earliest memories is my father coming home. He was a police officer, so he'd come home and we'd bond he'd read me comic books. Justice League, Batman. We would watch TV together as a family. And when I was 7, I saw Star Wars. It captured my imagination and ran away with it, basically. I think kind of like a huge sort of like big moment for me. I was 16 years old. And I mean, this kind of in some ways set the course of what I wanted to do with my life. I was 16 years old. And as a kid, like my grandfather liked to go to the dump a lot. I don't know why. The city dump. He was always generating trash.
The trash.
Yes.
Got
it. Yes. Dan. Yes.
Just making.
Never mind.
Getting clear.
We'll move on.
That's all I'm saying.
And he was always like creating, like he was doing yard work and stuff like that. And he would always take me with him. He needed some help getting the stuff out of his truck into the dump. And there was always a milkshake waiting for me at the end of this journey. So I would always say yes. One afternoon when I was 16, I was waiting for my grandfather to pick me up, and he's just taking forever, and he's kind of late, and he's not calling. I don't know why, and so I'm at home. I decided to watch TV. It's like 1:50 in the afternoon on Saturday, and I'm watching Cinemax, as many 16-year-old boys of my generation did, and if that means anything to anyone. And then And at 1:50, there was an announcer came on and said, "Coming up next, regarded by many as the greatest movie ever made, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane."
Yeah.
And I'm like, great, okay, well, and from 1941, like, yeah, right, some 1941 film is the greatest movie ever made. All right, I'll watch this until my grandfather came. And 2 o'clock strikes, I start watching Citizen Kane. And it's like a revelation. Like, oh my gosh, this movie is just so fantastically made and sophisticated for 1941. And as I'm watching it, I'm like, how do they do this? I wanted to know everything about how they made that movie. And as it happens, the second the movie was over, my grandfather shows up. And so I think that God really wanted me to watch Citizen Kane that afternoon. But from that moment on, I mean, I became obsessed with Citizen Kane. I want to know how it was made, how Orson Welles did it, the finances of it, the creativity of it. I made it my junior class project to write a research paper on how it was made, to critique it and its relationship to other movies. It was long and rambling. I only got a B. I'm really disappointed to this day.
Have you gone back to your teacher and had a conversation about that B yet?
We need to have a talk.
Maybe
definitely.
send her a ticket to the premiere.
There we go.
That might be kind of the justice.
You were wrong to give me a B.
That's right.
But from that moment forward, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I always I knew I wanted to write about culture. But even in the midst of that, what was interesting is my response to culture was also to create culture too. So I knew I wanted to do something creative. I didn't know exactly what. And then in my senior year of high school, I went to a Lutheran high school supported by great, amazing English teachers that were pointing us outward toward the world and engaging culture, not hiding from. And so they offered me this opportunity to apply for this scholarship to an art school in New York City. I was in a creative writing class, and they said, instead of taking the final, why don't you just fill out this application instead for this school? And I wrote a series of essays on culture, a profile on Roger Ebert, an essay on how comic books shaped my appreciation of art. And I got this scholarship. I went to the School of Visual Arts to study journalism of all things. And one thing from another led from there to my opportunity I graduated, got my first job at a magazine called Advertising Age, where I wrote about marketing and media. And that led to Entertainment Weekly, which led to other things.
Led to other things. Now, you mentioned with Citizen Kane that you were kind of exhaustive in your interests. It wasn't just the writing, it was the funding of it and the creating of it, and how did he do what he did visually.
Yeah.
Why did you land on the written word? Like, why was writing important? Do you just have an aptitude toward it, or?
Yeah, I always loved writing. I knew that I loved writing. I loved telling stories. It was something that I was good at. But when I saw Citizen Kane, and maybe even before that, but when I saw that, like, I definitely I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wish I could be a director. And, I maybe talk about this a little bit later, but 16 years old in 1986, to be a filmmaker, to train yourself to be a filmmaker, well, first of all, I didn't know a lot of other people that were filmmakers, so there was no one to mentor me or teach me. And you think about the equipment that has to be involved to experiment with that, a video camera. You think about you have to buy separate editing equipment, and it's a very complicated, costly process. Mm-hmm. And you think about now, nearly 30 years later, and kids these days have one-stop shopping to teach themselves filmmaking on an iPhone.
Well, talk a little bit about your son and what he's in the middle of right now.
Well, yeah, if only I was born now, I'd probably have a different career. But my son, 2 weeks ago, he's a Star Wars nut like me now too. So I guess I'm raising them well. And
steady diet of pop culture and consumption.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
He got it in his head that he wanted to just film a little scene of himself from Star Wars. So he spent the week in class when he should have been studying, writing a script, like a 10-shot script for a 5-minute scene, invited a buddy over on one Saturday afternoon, and with his iPhone, shot all of these scenes. This scene in which two Jedis fight. But there was an act structure to it, 3-act structure to it. And so he shot all these scenes on his iPhone, and then he activated an app, downloaded everything, edited it in his iPhone, scored it, put special effects in it. And I'm like, I was like, I wish I was born now. I'd be doing that. And I wish I could have been doing that in 1986. What really captures my imagination about my son's story is he's not alone. Everyone is doing this now. They're learning a whole storytelling language that's going to be super familiar to them. And you think about the storytelling revolution that looms 10 years from now, when an age of kids who are making, telling stories, creating stories on their iPhones, are going to be in a position to really be culture makers, either in Hollywood or independently on their own. It's really exciting and maybe scary to consider kind of where we're headed.
Well, some of what I'm hoping to do in our conversation today is talk in a couple kind of buckets of categories. So for example, one of them, and I'm hoping this is in line with some of the things you guys are interested in, I'm hoping to talk specifically about the creative act itself, so the actual being an artist, and we can be synonymous about what we mean by creative or artist, or even if it's kind of drilled down to a specific medium like writing or filmmaking or whatever it is that people are doing. But in that act of creating, that's one kind of bucket. A second bucket is our faith commitment. We have a common faith commitment, and even as we were planning this conference, some of the conversation, at least early on, we spent a fair amount of time thinking through, is the relevance of this conversation in place if we look at it through the lens as a Christian or not? Is this really a conversation about creativity, or is this a conversation about Christian creativity in this digital culture that we're in? And then the third conversation, or bucket of conversation I'm curious about is kind of so what? Given the culture that we're in, ought we to do things differently now as Christians that if we were thoughtful to, that would be helpful. So let's go back to the beginning and talk a little bit about creativity and maybe bridge to the second bucket around Christianity. I'm curious if you think a Christian artist ought to be a Christian artist, or a Christian artist ought to be an artist who is Christian. Does that distinction line up at all? Do you guys get what I'm talking about when I say this? Okay.
Yeah. So let me just kind of say some stuff, and maybe I'll answer your question.
That's great. We've had conversations before, friends. This is not new.
I kind of push back on both of those things.
Perfect.
I don't think of myself as a Christian artist, or probably in my case, a Christian writer. If you just read my writing, I don't think that I would conform to that. My writing is not marked by any kind of I swear a lot in my writing, so I don't know if I'm using very pleasing language to God, but that's how I express myself. I don't necessarily
but
write...
I don't experience you as gratuitous in that. It seems like descriptive, like it's intentional.
Great, I've fooled you. That's awesome. It's totally gratuitous. No.
Just makes me feel less guilty about reading it, that's all.
I don't necessarily write explicitly about Christian topics. I'm not name-checking Jesus, and I'm not spreading the 4 spiritual laws. Am I a writer am I a Christian who happens to be a writer? Well, I think that feels more true. What I push back on, though, is any sense of identity in which I'm defined by what I do. So I just think that leads to a dead end and leads to idolatry. So where I start with...
Can you say more about that part? Or do
well, maybe I'll get to that.
Okay,
Let's see.
Great.
Like, I start with just the identity statement that I am Jeff, and I'm almost 45 years old, and I'm just this accumulation of experience, and that I'm a Christian. I was created by God, and I've been saved by Jesus. So I really kind of believe that. My next identity statements really come like I'm a dad, I'm a son, I take that seriously, and I'm a friend, And in that, I write first and foremost as a blessing that's been given by God to provide for my family. So that's kind of really how I organize it. And my artistic journey has really been coming to recognize slowly and surely like what kind of opportunities I might have to honor God with my writing. And I've kind of selected kind of like 2 kind of areas to really kind of like tackle. And one is just engaging culture, critiquing culture, and recognize valuable ideas that I hope to kind of like pass along to people so that when they're consuming culture, they can keep those things in their mind. The other thing that I like to do with my writing increasingly is respond to narratives in the culture, narratives that I think might be good, but also might be negative, that might have a detrimental impact on us, that are maybe lead us away from God, or at least truth, or even like what it means to be fully humanized. Because I think we live in a really dehumanizing culture and reductive culture. So I find in my writing, whether it's like my graphic novel about my dad, or whether it's even Tomorrowland, and the degree to which I participated ideas to that Tomorrowland specifically, is a very specific response to dominant stories of our time that are exclusively pessimistic, cynical, that look to the future with a fair amount of fear and projections of dystopia and apocalypse, and what that's doing to us, and how that affects our life now. And we seek to maybe respond to that in a counterculture fashion. So, did I answer your question?
Almost. You almost got there. You did, actually. But I'm curious. I would like to kind of circle back around to the question about idolatry.
Yeah.
And just say more about what you mean by that.
Okay, so what I've experienced in my own life and my own work is a struggle around being significant by doing what I do. The constant war that I think I fight on a daily basis, even with my own writing, is tending to my brand, promoting my brand, writing something that has impact, you know, large or small. And I think that that is a product of many things, including existing in a culture in which we are defined by what we do as doers, that we have to produce and produce something of significance. This is true in the secular culture. This is true in our evangelical culture, where we're kind of fixated on, like, how can I impact the world for Christ? And that kind of thinking is, especially in the latter case, is good thinking. I think that we should be thinking about how we can impact the world for Christ. But it's fascinating to me how quickly that can lead toward being more about me and I'm great and look what I did, and then having an unhealthy relationship to work. I think that's kind of an idolatrous idea, and that's what I meant by that.
It's so helpful. Earlier this morning, there was a couple references to this guy who really should get an honorarium for the amount of times he's getting referenced to, Jeremy Coward. But one of the things that he talked about is this photographer out of Nashville, and he makes a distinction between should photographers, as he's trying to kind of help folks get along in that craft, should photographers spend more energy trying to be seen or to learn how to see? And there's some of that in what I'm hearing you say, that particularly, like all of culture, but particularly evangelicals, might be susceptible to that same kind of temptation of it's more important, like I'm looking at vanity metrics on Twitter, or I'm looking at, and even for good causes, like because, you know, if we get 25,000 views on a thing, that must mean something good for Jesus, right? When in fact it might not even be about Jesus.
Yeah.
Am I hearing you right?
No, yeah. You know, when I was writing Lost recaps and writing about Lost, I was never happier than in the earlier days of that, in which I was just kind of pouring my entire mind and imagination into these things and kind of like giving them to the world and putting them on the internet and not really thinking about what I was doing, you know, and just having fun and bringing all of myself into that work. And I wrote those recaps under a name like Doc Jensen. And over time, I was lucky enough to have a following. And over time, though, like I became too self-aware of Doc Jensen and now needed to feed that and manage that. And it actually stopped being meaningful, you know? I think it's Henry Nouwen who talks about, and this is a struggle we see in the secular world or among Christians, however you define yourself, how we kind of have the folly of chasing like three things that lead us away from God: relevancy, spectacle, and control. And I think a lot about that in my writing, and my relationship to culture making, you know? There's this great documentary that's coming out later this year that I just read about. I haven't seen, about the evangelical, remember the Power Team? You guys ever heard of the Power Team?
I don't know.
From like the early 80s or like whatever. So that like they were like a group of weightlifters and like stunt performers, and they were all buffed up, and they came out of that decade that was fixated with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone and all of that. And then they would perform these feats of strength. And
are we going to do that right? No, we're not going to do that right now. Okay, good.
And what's interesting about it is that the origin of that team, they became massively popular, and they would put on these huge like revivals. They would play in stadiums, and 80,000 people would come, and 40,000 people would give their life to Christ, and it was this awesome thing. And the show that they put on was pretty amazing. They put on these stunts, and they would be all strong men, and then they'd give their testimonies, and they're like these powerful testimonies of these people who had really honked up lives, and like and how they found Jesus, and they were rescued out of that, and made them strong, and now was their source of strength. And then they would perform again, and that would be a metaphorical expression of what Jesus did for them. And they had this massive cultural impact. And then they became a brand. And then the relationship to so like here and how it began, I'm telling this story out of order, is that what's interesting though is that it started, though, from a guy who was actually doing a very humble prison ministry. And he thought, how can I be more significant? How can I have a greater impact? And he came up with this idea, and they became very popular. And they created, and then they tried to figure, so this idea was like relevant to the culture of the time. They created this massive spectacle, and then it fell apart because they became too invested in it, and managing the success got to them, and there was a lot of bad stuff that went on, and they ended up in decline and fragmented. It's a little Tower of Babel-ish, right? So they built this sort of like culture, this piece of culture, and their sense of significance, it got bound up with their own sense of significance, if that makes sense.
It does. Well, so you've referenced culture several times, and I want to turn a corner and talk about that for a second, because that notion of the culture that we're in, as someone who grew up in another country, ended up transferring to this fine institution in the 90s, this place feels very different than it did in the 90s. In fact, the air in Southern California, not just physically, but the culture, everything just feels very different now that we're in this kind of digital age. And I don't know if digital is the right kind of category to put it in or not, but talk a little bit about the ways that you've seen popular culture shift in the last, say, 10 or 20 years. And in particular, what kind of input you'd give to Christians in that changing culture. Meaning, are there blind spots that Christians might have now that we might want to be conscious to? Are there things that might have made sense 15 or 20 years ago that today, in the culture that we're in, really don't make sense anymore? Or more constructively, what are things that Christians could be doing in this particular culture that might be most helpful to the kingdom idea? Maybe not to draw a spectacle or be significant, but what would be most helpful? So those are the three things that come to mind. Blind
there
spots.
Were 5 things there.
There were, yeah. That's how I ask questions. I'm no journalist. You're the journalist. The 3 things are blind spots in our culture, things that have shifted, and then opportunities.
Yeah, here's how I would respond to that. Those series of fine questions, which is, I think that when I started at Entertainment Weekly, when I started in journalism in 1992, the huge technological innovation, the bold new way that we in journalism were going to communicate more directly with people was the fax machine, and that was like the advertising age. I remember the day that we launched the ad age daily fax. And
that's a thing? That's a really
that
thing.
was a real thing. That
wow.
we had subscribers, and we faxed this thing out to people, right? And from how long has it been? I'm getting old. 20 some odd years, the revolution where now we live in this sort of real digital space where we're impacting scores, thousands of people through our website. I mean, it's just been a major shift, a major disruptive shift that has changed journalism and how we think of ourselves. It's changed the business of ourselves. It's imperiled old media and print media. And I feel like I straddle 2 generations leaning toward print and old media. I feel almost like a dinosaur already, it's been fascinating. Culture, as I define it, as like pop culture products. Culture is a huge word. It can apply to a lot of different things. So how I kind of define it as media products and pop culture products, there used to sort of exist this divide, right? Where, and let's talk about it from a Christian perspective, but I think that people who aren't Christians can relate to this too. Culture was a thing that was out here, right? Like we could ignore it if we wanted to. We exist outside it. We can, if we were a Christian, we engage it, we critique it, we mimic it, replicate it, but we, or we just even wade into it and consume it, right?
But it's a distinct entity.
But it's a distinct entity. There is us, there is us in culture. It's culture is something that you come to, something that you purchase, you acquire, or you can leave it be, right? In the digital era, what I think we're beginning to see is that if culture is like an ocean and we live on the land and we can live separate from it, or we can go alongside it and critique it or wade into it or replicate it with artificial lakes and stuff like that. Well, now that culture has just swamped us, and that's what it feels like to me to live in the digital age, where through our phones, through our devices, through our computers, all of our entertainment is coming now through these devices, and we are constantly have access to culture. We can be consuming culture right now. We can pick up our phones and watch Netflix or go on Facebook. And that's the other kind of interesting thing that's fascinating about our digital culture too, is that it's turned all of us into culture makers. You think about how we exist on Twitter, or we exist on Facebook and social media, where if you are sharing a piece of media, look at this funny video I found, look at this crazy, this political article that I found or whatever, and sharing it with your people. You're a culture keeper, and you're and
a curator, really.
Culture, right?
Yeah.
Or you could create stuff of your own and put on it and put it on the on social media. So we're culture makers as a result of this, and this is a huge revolution. And again, as I said, with the example of my son, it'll be fascinating to see kind of where it goes.
So would one of the blind spots then for Christians be, again, that we might think we're not awash, that somehow we are kind of impervious to?
Yeah, I mean, from a Christian perspective, like the old categories of gestures and postures, our gestures toward how we express ourselves culturally, or our relationship to culture, is in a state of flux. We're in it. We can't be separated from it, even if we really wanted to anymore. I think it'd actually be reckless if we are, because like if what we're trying to do is speak into people's lives, we've got to know the stories that are shaping them and the narratives that they're consuming and how it's affecting them. And I think that we have to be on top of that. We have to understand that for the sake of reaching people and loving people, right? So I was going to say something and I completely forgot.
Well, practically then, if that's so, what's an appropriate Christian response? Like, so I'm in the midst of it, I'm swimming in it, and what do I do from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think about the ways in which, say, Christian filmmakers and what passes for Christian film.
Well, even the
days.
category Christian film.
Yeah,
it's in many ways a market. And in fact, let's take a quick little side note. Maybe this will be helpful. One of the articles that Jeff wrote several years ago, you guys may remember a little movie called The Passion of the Christ that came out. And that movie was a very controversial movie for a lot of different reasons. But one of the folks who was critical of the movie before it came out was Jeff Jansen, who wrote this cover article for Entertainment Weekly magazine. I wish I had the cover right now to show you guys. It said, "Will Mel Gibson survive the Passion of the Christ?" And that was the big cover. And this was before the movie came out and made $1 billion. And then I think you guys wrote a follow-up article that said, well, something to the effect of like, well, it looks like he survived, like it went fine. But then things played out in other ways for Mr. Gibson. And as you kind of walk that out, that kind of crazy cycle of news and everything that went on around that movie and him in particular, here we have this professing Catholic Christian who seemed to be doing something important. While that was happening, there was this marketing machine that was targeting evangelicals in particular and created this first kind of template for how to bring out a Christian movie to the marketplace. And then everything else surrounded that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that moment and things that you were learning through that process. We talked a little bit about this offline, but just share kind of some of your observations about that time.
What was interesting about that movie and at that time was it was that movie and a movie before it, The Omega Code. Remember The Omega Code? Mm-hmm. Where, like, I think that came out in like 1999. Mm-hmm. Before that point, before this sort of double whammy of The Omega Code and The Passion of the Christ, the mainstream culture had no idea there was this thing called Christian cinema, or that people were making movies for a Christian audience, right? And so these two movies like were a sort of a great awakening from this for the secular culture of like, oh wow, like this is a thing, and so that was fascinating in general. And what the Omega Code taught Hollywood and what it taught Mel Gibson was how the evangelical network and the system of churches in our country could be used to help market a movie on a grassroots level. The Passion of the Christ is fascinating. There's a lot of ways in which I really admire the Passion of the Christ. Like, what's undeniable is that Mel Gibson made a movie that is just very much of himself. Like, that movie is a piece of religious art in the sense of, like, it is a very specific reflection and meditation on one aspect of Jesus and what that means to Mel, like the suffering and death of Jesus and that sacrifice standing in for all of us. And as a sort of ambition, I think that's a beautiful ambition. And in many of the ways in which he realized it, I think were extremely powerful and relatable. And in other ways, I think were flawed representationally. The way he represented some of the ideas was flawed. So, and I think that in ways that it couldn't have been and ultimately resulted in being polarizing. Where I was most critical of the movie, and where I'm just critical in general of how Christian cinema is marketed, and Christian movies in particular, is sort of the culture war aspect. Because what Mel recognized was that, that was 2004, was a really polarizing time in our country. The idea of culture war was very prominent. And that movie was under attack by a lot of Jewish leaders and a lot of people who thought that it was anti-Semitic, and it was, and he used that he denied that first and foremost, but then he used it in a way to sort of like galvanize Christians and pitting us against them to create controversy that got awareness for his movie and drove us all to the theaters. I really resented that. And I think that just in general, since then, we see a lot of Christian movies that are ultimately kind of like try to follow that model by actually being kind of like these really provocative cultural engagements that try to mix things up, which in some ways I kind of admire. There is a level in which I kind of admire Kirk Cameron's Saving Christmas, if Kirk Cameron aspires to be the Christian right, Michael Moore, there are worse things to be, and that's kind of actually a really provocative ground to stake out. But at the same time, that's all we're getting, it seems, unless it's like counter-programming or evangelical tools. And so, I would love to see more of that, because I don't want to really be seen as judging that too much. I think there's actually a place for that kind of filmmaking and that kind of cultural response and engagement. But what we need is, we just need more formally sophisticated storytelling from our movies.
Just really crafted, well done storytelling.
But we need a broader range of subject matter, and what we really need, I think, is more personal filmmaking for Christian filmmakers or filmmakers who are Christian, people who are just, whether it's through fiction or nonfiction, opening themselves up to the culture, to people, so that people can see how this Christian thing is being worked out in our real lives, for better or worse, flawed and otherwise. Transparency and humility, I think, are things that in my own walk, when I talk with people who are not Christians, they want to see more from in me, and they want to see more from in general. They want to see less Pharisee going to the temple to pray and saying, thank God I'm not like him, thank God I'm like me, and look how self-righteous I am. And they want to see more tax collectors saying, I'm screwed up, help me work this out, God. I'm a fallen human being. I think they want to see more of us, of that in art.
Well, you personally have experienced a lot of that, and I asked in advance if this was okay for me to ask about this last year. You lost your wife, Amy, a Biola grad, by the way, to brain cancer, and tragic experience. And through the process of grieving and going through that with your kids and community and family, in many ways, as someone who had a platform and a voice to a pretty broad audience, you were transparent. And very much the very things that you were prescribing, you were in the midst of. You were challenged, you were doubting, you were honest, you were angry. And the response struck me as like you were giving people a gift of some sort. Can you talk a little bit about this season that you've been walking in, and how that is, both your own process about expressing things and also how others were responding?
Yeah, Amy was diagnosed with cancer in early 2007. And the same week, same month that we discovered she had cancer, we had cancer, she had cancer. I was a victim of identity theft. I found out that some guy had stolen my social security number and my name, and had racked up $50,000, $60,000, $70,000.
It was actually $60,520. Oh, wait, it wasn't me. It was somebody else.
Lost numbers, Dane? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I racked up all these charges, and it was a huge nightmare and a huge mess to clean it up. I tell you that story because the whole idea, and it's taken years and years to get over that. And it felt so invasive, and it felt so identity theft, like someone stole my identity and my own identity was compromised and kind of imploded. And in many ways, that idea was the defining idea of our journey with Amy, where beginning with cancer in 2007, and she died last summer, there was 2 distinct bouts of cancer, in which our identity and everything that we kind of our relationship to our identity just was extremely challenged, and we felt under siege. And we're blessed to have lots of family near and far, and friends near and far, and they wanted to know about us. So I used Facebook as a sort of a means to really kind of just share about what's going on with our family, what's going on with me, what's going on with Amy, how it's impacting our 3 kids. And I just decided that I was just really raw and honest about how this was really screwing up our lives. And what was really valuable for me in that was, it was a way to salvage our identity and fight for our identity, because this kind of felt like it was really unraveling us, And the response that I got was alternately TMI, too much information, but in a good way, but in a lot of other ways, just people really appreciated the transparent struggle of us being angry, of us struggling through this to see God, to find God, experience God, but also how we found we were supported amazingly by our community, and we experienced God through that. And it became really important to continue to share that with people through the online media that we had.
What struck me as your friend in the middle of it was, it felt like you were being Christian and honest at the same time, and existentially honest. And what I was especially struck by was the way that all sorts of folks with different traditions and belief systems and lifestyles and whatever, all were drawn in, not just in a sympathetic way, but I think in a very interested way.
Yeah.
And it was impressive.
Can I just respond to real quick something about that? Which is,
yeah.
There's one way in which I look back on that and I wish I could improve, right? I mean, it was hard to see in the middle of it. I don't know if I really would do anything different, right?
Of course.
I've been really kind of, at our church down in Long Beach at Grace Brethren, there's been a really kind of robust teaching on the Psalms. And I love the idea of Psalms as a sort of model for art, model for storytelling, but even for the model of the way that we express our experience, where there's sort of a declaration to God, there is an expression of suffering, there's even freedom to say, where are you? And then by the end of it, though, kind of like doubling down on God, trusting in God anew and saying, like, you are my everything. I will follow you no matter where I go. My writing during that time was a lot of that middle act. It was a lot of suffering and a lot of like, where are you? And I look forward to kind of moving into a period of time where I'm more so in the last act of that kind of expression.
Can we thank Jeff Jansen for being here today?
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.